Welcome to Foundations in Psychology. I'm Dr. Ryan Langridge, and today we'll be discussing the cerebral cortex. The cortex is the outermost layer of the brain and is responsible for many of our higher order processes, such as thinking, planning, decision-making, emotion regulation, focusing attention, perception, and so on. The cortex is composed primarily of what is called gray matter. Gray matter refers to the cell bodies and dendrites of the neuron. The term gray matter comes from the grayish-pinkish color of this part of the neuron. We refer to the axons as white matter due to the fatty myelin sheath that coats the outside of the axon, which appears white. The first thing you'll notice when you look at the cortex is its wrinkled or folded appearance. And we actually have special names for these folds. The protrusions are referred to as gyri, or the singular gyrus, while the spaces in between these folds are referred to as sulci, or the singular sulcus. Often you'll hear these terms used when referencing certain landmarks of the brain, such as the central sulcus or the superior temporal gyrus. The fact that the cortex is folded means that we can fit a large surface area into a relatively small space, in other words, the human skull. And here more surface area means more neurons, which means more processing power. The cortex is typically divided into four lobes: the frontal lobes, parietal lobes, occipital lobes, and temporal lobes. The frontal lobes are often associated with what we call our executive functioning, things like planning and decision making, inhibitory control, saying no when we really want to say yes, emotional regulation, and attention. Towards the back of the frontal lobes, we have a strip of cortex referred to as the primary motor cortex, and it's this area of the brain that controls our voluntary movement. Neurons carry information from our primary motor cortex to the muscles in our body responsible for these movements. We also have a specialized area in our frontal lobes called Broca's area, which is responsible for the production of speech and language. The parietal lobes are typically associated with visual spatial attention and bodily awareness, meaning the sense of our body's position in space. At the front of the parietal lobes, we have the primary somatosensory cortex, and it's this area in the brain that is responsible for processing sensory information from the skin, like touch and temperature. At the very back of the brain, we have our occipital lobes. Areas in the occipital lobe, such as the primary visual cortex, are responsible for processing visual information. This information will be then sent from the visual cortex to other areas of the cortex for further processing. For example, according to the two visual systems hypothesis of vision, information will be sent from the primary visual cortex upwards towards the parietal lobe, where it will be further used for the control of visually guided action. Likewise, visual information moving from the visual cortex downwards into the temporal lobes will be used for visual perception and object recognition. It's processing here that allows us to recognize what it is that we're looking at. The temporal lobe is associated with a long list of behaviors. For example, we find in the temporal lobes the primary auditory cortex, where information captured by our ears is processed and creates our perception of sound. The temporal lobe is also very important for memory, due to its close connections with a subcortical structure called the hippocampus, which is very important for the forming and recalling of memories. The temporal lobes also have many connections to a subcortical structure called the amygdala, which is important for emotional processing. As we just mentioned, visual information traveling from the occipital lobe will also reach the temporal lobes for further processing. We also have a specialized area within the temporal lobes called Wernicke's area, which is responsible for our understanding and comprehension of language. It's important to note that the cerebral cortex is involved in a very long list of behaviors, some of which we've covered here, but many of which we have not touched on. In this video, we've described the four lobes of the cerebral cortex, as well as listed some of the typical behaviors associated with these areas. Before we close today, I think it's important to also note that while there are certain behaviors associated with certain specific regions of the cortex, most of our behaviors actually are the result of communication between many different areas throughout the cortex, as well as a number of subcortical structures. In many cases, it is being oversimplistic to try and explain one behavior with one specific brain area. Rather, Learning how specific regions of the cortex communicate within these networks will lead to a much better, thorough understanding of these behaviors. We hope you enjoyed learning about the cortex. If you have any questions about anything we've discussed today, or if you have any suggestions for a future video, please feel free to leave us a comment. As always, if you've enjoyed the videos, please like and subscribe to the channel.